Hello, and thank you for joining us on Aviation News Talk for a Newsmakers Edition, where we sit down and talk to people who are making the news. Now, there's been much discussion in the industry of a pilot shortage, especially for the regional airlines. But there's also a shortage of CFIs, or certificated flight instructors, who teach pilots how to get a pilot certificate or an advanced rating. And in a moment, we'll be sitting down with Jason Blair. He's a designated pilot examiner who'll talk about the CFI shortage. And he'll also talk about what you can do about it. Also, we've made a change, and it's now easier to reach our Patreon page, and I'll tell you about that. But now stand by, because this Newsmakers Edition starts now. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation and the people in our industry. I'm Max Truscott, and if you're new to the show, we have a weekly show that shares pilot safety tips and general aviation news from around the world. But we also interview movers and shakers in the aviation industry, which is what we're doing today. Earlier this week, we talked with Jason Blair about what many of us have known for a long time, which is that there's a shortage of CFIs. And we also talked about a few solutions to the problem. In just a second, we'll get to that interview. But I want to thank listener Troy, who took the time to email me this week to tell me he was having trouble trying to get to our Patreon page. And if he was having trouble, I'm sure there were at least 10 more people who were having trouble. What I've never mentioned on the show before was that getting to our Patreon page is actually a two-step process. I always gave people the first step, which was to go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. But I never told you that once you got there, you need to then click on another link on that page to get to the Patreon page. Well, I have fixed that. So now it truly is a one-step process. So if you've tried to get to the page before and didn't succeed, try it again. Just type in your browser, aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and it will take you directly to the page. Then click on post, and you can see the many posts that I've mentioned on the show that I've put there for our listeners to see. And while you're there, please sign up for one of our various reward levels. You can donate as little as $2 a month or more. And everyone who donates gets their name read on the show. Plus, at the higher donation amounts, you get various goodies, including detailed notes for each show. And at the $20 a month level, I'll read your name every month on the first show of the month. As you know, these podcasts are free, but they do cost money to create. So far, we have about 3% of our listeners who donate, so help make it 4%. Thanks very much. Now let's talk to Jason. Now let me tell you a little bit about Jason Blair. Jason is an FAA DPE, or designated pilot examiner, who gives check rides to pilots, and he's also an active flight instructor. He's the past executive director of NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and he served on a number of industry committees. Now, he's also one of our supporters who donates money each month through patreon.com to support the Aviation News Talk podcast, and you may remember him from episode 39 when he talked about the pilot examiner shortage and common problems people have on their check ride. Well, Jason, you are our first return guest. Thank you so much for joining us here today on the Aviation News Talk podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you, and a bit of an honor to be the first person to get to come back twice so far.
That's right. After 5 times, you get your own jacket. It's kind of like Saturday Night Live.
Excellent.
Join the
Hopefully
club.
it's a warm one, because it certainly is not warm where I'm at here in Michigan right now as we record this.
Yeah, and you just told me 3 feet of snow. Makes me happy to be here in California.
You know, it's good for snowshoeing, but not the greatest flight training weather. It's been a little tough to get any training or check rides done lately. So soon that will hopefully change. All things in good time, right?
Unless you're teaching on skis.
Which is getting tempting. The lakes are starting to get frozen enough, so we're heading towards that direction too.
Put those skis on the Cirrus and the Cessna.
Well, at least an old tail wheel. So
Yep, good. Hey, the reason I asked you to come here today is I have been sitting on a question from Simon, which he sent to me a couple of months ago, and I thought you would be the perfect person to help answer it. So shall I let it run?
Yeah, please.
Hi, Max. My name is Simon, and I'm a flight student at Embry-Riddle in Prescott, Arizona. And I wanted to ask about how the pilot shortage is affecting flight training. Over the past year, I've been working on my private license with Embry-Riddle. I currently have 82 hours, and I'm still working on private. I have just recently stopped training with Embry-Riddle and started with a local flight school. Over the past year, I've averaged about 1.5 lessons a week. The school is having problems retaining instructors. From what I've heard, it's because of the demand of pilots. And I've also heard that Embry-Riddle is not the only school having this issue. I'd like to know if you have heard of this issue and what your opinion is on this matter. Thank you for what you do. It's a great show.
Well, thanks, Simon. Yes, not only have I heard about this issue, I have just read extensively about the issue from Jason. Jason, you've just posted some information on your website. Tell us what you posted, then we'll answer Simon's question.
I have. It's actually certainly not something that is brand new to the industry, at least in the recent past, and it's certainly something that we've been discussing at some very high-level national levels with also some Embry-Riddle folks, but other universities and the FAA and folks from the Regional Airline Association and Delta Airlines, and take your pick. There's been a few that we started having some meetings to discuss this pilot shortage issue that we're having, and some of that discussion has specifically addressed CFI shortages, and the white paper Max is referring to is one that we entitled CFI Staffing Availability for Flight Training Providers, and there's some compensation considerations in there that we're postulating maybe assisting in this, but the gist is we really do have a shortage of flight instructors at many of the large-scale training providers, those that really kind of do that throughput training towards the airlines. And what we're finding is very common at places like Embry-Riddle and UND and ATP and many of the large flight training providers is the instructors are staying approximately 7 to 9 months before they are hired very quickly by regional airlines. And anybody who's really kind of looking to go to a regional airline is finding themselves hired almost as quickly as they have the minimum required hours. And in some cases, conditional job offers are issued well ahead of them getting it. And all they have to do is put that time in. And as soon as they get there, they've got a job, which is exactly what poor Simon here is experiencing. And that means the instructors disappear very quickly at the flight training providers. And a couple really negative effects of that is obviously the turnover rate for the flight training provider does make it hard for them to standardize these instructors and get them in and get them assigned. But it also means a transition of instructors for the students where you don't have the same instructor for a long enough period of time to get your training done. And it really does hinder the training function for each student who's trying to get something done. And each time they have to get a new instructor, it adds a little bit of time as they familiarize with each other. And there's some delays happening in that training. So this is certainly an issue that Simon is bringing up that we are paying very, very close attention to and trying to come up with some solutions for to either stem that turnover or come up with ways to make it not affect the students who are receiving the training as adversely.
Yeah, there's no question. It helps to be able to have continuity with the same instructor. I've talked with people in the past who've had a whole succession of instructors as each leaves for the airlines, and it just makes it more difficult for someone to train and to get their rating. And yeah, there's a local flight school here that I know of that has a waiting list where people want to learn to get their private. They end up waiting 3, 4, 5 months before there's someone available to train them at that school. So, Simon, it is definitely a big problem. But let's put some historical context on this. Do you remember the great CFI shortage back of 2000, 2001?
You know, I do kind of remember parts of it, and then obviously 2001 we had a major change in the industry,
Yep.
and some economic challenges in the mid-2000s that did contract things. But as we look at historical numbers, back in the 90s we were making somewhere between 6,500 and 7,500 CFIs per year on average that were getting certificated. And then we actually saw a drop off in that in the mid 90s to very similar levels to what we're seeing now, which if you think about that, you start making less CFIs, eventually that has a little bit of an effect. And there's less CFIs available to do the training as the airlines hire them away. So right now we're actually kind of averaging somewhere between 4,000 to 4,500 CFI certificates issued per year. And on a general trend, that's actually down. If you couple that with really aggressive hiring by the airlines, which is what we're experiencing, it just means there's less CFIs available to provide that training. Now, this is a little bit of a tough thing to kind of get your brain around. If we look at the total number of CFIs out there, we're actually significantly up from where we used to historically be. If we go back to the 99-2000 point, we had about 80,000 CFIs that were in the ranks of people who had an active CFI certificate. Basically, an active CFI certificate, according to the FAA, just means they have one. It doesn't mean they have a medical, it just means they have a CFI certificate that has been renewed or issued within the last 2 years. So on the surface, it sounds, hey, that's great. We've got a whole bunch of them. we're going up actually. So the problem is, so also is the age of those CFIs. Since that same 1999 period, we've gone from an average of a little under 44 years old as an average age for a CFI to a little over 48 years old for an average of a CFI. What it means is we have a lot of CFIs who are over the age of 40. Matter of fact, it went from 57% to over 68% of them being over the age of 40 with an active CFI certificate in that same time period. Well, we kind of know the active CFIs, that are the ones that are really providing training, are typically younger CFIs that are doing so, and they're doing it to gain that flight experience and time, and then they transition out into other professional flying jobs. What's happening is we have also an aging pilot population at the same time, and this is where we're also seeing problems with the concern for a shortage of pilots when we have a large number of pilots who are aging to the point where they will no longer be able to serve in airlines after age 65. Well, many of those are the same people that hold CFI certificates. They got it when they were younger, and they don't want to lose it, so they keep that certificate active as they fly for an airline. And let's be honest, they're not out there providing much training that helps backfill the pilot population. They're actually doing professional flying jobs. They just happen to have a CFI certificate at the same time. We've kind of backed into some of the numbers here as we look at this, and we actually find that there's a very small percentage of the CFIs that are probably providing training on a year-to-year basis. Many of them are doing professional flying jobs. In reality, it's probably less than 20% of the CFI population that in any one given year has actually signed even one student off for a pilot certificate or rating. So it's really kind of a small number, a small percentage that's actively engaged in the training side, which means if we have more pilots that are trying to come in and we hire some more out and we're trying to train more, we hit a constriction in the market of being able to provide that training that's also related to the turnover of the CFIs not staying in those positions for a long period of time.
Well, so obviously we've got multiple problems. CFIs are staying in their jobs a shorter period of time, and there's a tiny percentage of CFIs who are actually doing the teaching. Yeah, I've always felt that the reason we have so many CFIs who renew their certificate but who are not actively teaching is that these are folks who may have an active flying career with the airlines, and they're using that really as insurance. If they get furloughed by the airlines, they want to be able to go back to teaching, and they know that if they don't renew their CFI, it's going to be a major, major amount of work to get that CFI certificate back. So it seems like, what, would you say about 80% of the people are just renewing their CFIs just as insurance?
We actually kind of look with some level of detail, although the data is not perfect on this. It's not a published piece that the FAA collates. Based on some work I've done with flight instructor refresher course providers, which is basically a 2-day course that CFIs can take to keep that CFI certificate every 2 years active, we find that it's probably around 79 to 80,000 of those that are being conducted every 2 years, which means that you're looking at about 80% of the people who have CFI certificates are not either one having gotten a CFI certificate issued within the last 2 years or upgraded it. So if they do upgrade to an MEI or a double I, that does renew it for them, or they have not done enough training sign-offs, which is, more than 5 sign-offs in a 2-year period gets you a renewal as long as you keep a marginally good pass rate, 80% being the number there. So we have a large number of CFIs that aren't meeting those 2 criterion, and they have to do that first. So, and I think you're absolutely correct that there's a backup option for CFIs who keep that certificate active. But I also think it's a matter of pride as well. And, some of them want to do a little teaching on the side. They might do some flight reviews or a couple instrument checkouts, or maybe they teach their son or daughter how to fly. But there's some level of pride in I earned this, and I don't want to give it up. And if all it means I have to do is an online course or an in-person FERC once in a while, they don't allow that to disappear. And I think that's pretty cool to keep it for your career. But they're not actively engaged in providing what we'll call throughput training that backfills the pilots.
Let's go back to what you were talking before about aging. You had mentioned the average age of CFIs has gone up over the last 20 years or so. Why do you think that is, and what do you think the implications are of having a slightly older, CFI cadre, or does it not matter?
I think there's a couple things. It's not good or bad. I think it's just a statistical point, but it does give us some indication of what's happening. And we look at this with our pilot population as well. The simple fact is We made a lot more pilots. We also made a lot more flight instructors if we go back to the 80s and 90s than we are doing so now. As those pilots age, they become a bigger percentage of that pool, whether it's the overall pilot population or the CFI population in this case. So, if we're only making 5,000 a year this year versus 9,000 a year back in the mid 90s, as they get older, they become a bigger representative piece of that pool. Now, at some point, age is going to catch up with all of us. I'm certainly going to catch up with them as well, and we're going to see these individuals dropping back off, and then we'll probably have a significant drop in the total number of CFI certificates that are out there, or as individuals do allow their certificates to expire. Imagine somebody who's 65 and jumps out of the airline career, and maybe they flight instruct kind of part-time as a retirement gig till they're 70, and eventually they say, look, I'm tired, I don't want to do this anymore, and they let that certificate expire. Somewhere between, 65 and maybe 105, these guys are all going to drop off, and it's probably somewhere between the 65 to 85 range. There aren't a whole lot of CFIs out there over the age of 85. So we know we're going to see in the next 10 years, much like the pilot population, some level of drop-off in that CFI certificate level. And right now they just represent a really big percentage of the overall number of CFIs that are out there.
I was thinking that this aging of the population may not really affect the age of the people who are actively teaching if, we say that 80% of the people are working for the airlines perhaps or corporate flying and they're just keeping the CFI in their pocket. This is probably the group that's really mostly accounts for this increase in age, don't you think?
I think it does, and there's actually some kind of interesting discussion I've had with a few other industry folks on this, and we're starting to see as this shortage of CFIs is affecting how training providers are able to make their business model work. They're starting to get more creative on how they want to compensate and how they want to incentivize CFIs to either stay longer or potentially even stay as permanent staff in some of the provider locations to do this job. I mean, there are a level of people out there. There's a number of us as CFIs who love teaching. I think you and I are certainly examples of that. No, I never went to an airline. It wasn't what I've done so far, and I really enjoy teaching. So if the right opportunity comes around and the university or a large-scale training provider says, hey, we're going to give you 65, 70, 80, maybe 100 grand a year, they start to look at that as a career option with the right benefits instead of making the jump to an airline. And in some cases, there are different lifestyle benefits that some value more than others. And the reality is if we can convince a few providers to recognize that and a small percentage of the CFI cadre to value that, we'll probably slow down much of that turnover and in some cases maybe even reduce costs for the training provider by allowing them to not have to continue recruiting new staff and allowing them to standardize their instructors for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I can see how if wages go up for CFIs, the airlines are going to have a harder time attracting them. And actually, the other side of that is if the average age of the CFI population goes up to 65, the airlines can't attract them, right? They're too old.
Right. There's actually a point at, we draw them back at some point. So maybe we need to start looking at the retirees from the airlines and saying, hey, come on back here and use that experience you've gained in 20 or 30 or 40 years of flying at an airline and bring it back to our training environment. And even if they give somebody 5 or 10 years, it can be very, very valuable to have senior people back in some of these training environments.
And what a great opportunity that is, both for the airline pilots who choose to do that as well as for the students who get to fly with them. Hey, one of the things you talked about in the beginning of your paper was you said that the training market was splitting. Tell us a little bit about career versus recreational flying and how you're seeing that split becoming more defined in the market.
Sure, and I think this is a little bit anecdotal. I don't have great data on it, although I will tell you we are doing some kind of work on trying to evaluate the throughput training market and determine how much of that really is represented in the total number of certificates issued out there. But what we're finding is customers are getting savvy. They don't want to sit at their local FBO sometimes and do this training over 4 or 5 years' time. So many of them are going to collegiate and university programs, and many of them are even selecting, especially if they have a degree already and they might be a career changer, to going to academy style training. I mean, there's some wonderfully well placed and large and quality training environments out there that do very, very large percentages of the training in this country, and they get it done very quickly. I mean, some of these academy style training programs have extremely proficient programs out there, and they'll get it done in 8, 9, 10 months. So somebody can go literally kind of from zero to hero in that time period. And I know If we look historically, we've had some backlash from the senior training industry of we're not making good pilots if we're just chunking them out in the pilot mills. Well, the reality is what we're doing is we're building a base certificate that somebody needs to have basic skills, and then they're going to an airline and they're training them to fly in that environment with their training. They're getting that ATP, CTP training at whatever regional airline they go to, and then they're continuing on to a first officer seat and moving on. And I kind of personally have a general thought that maybe we've got some changes happening in this training industry, and our 1940s mindset was let's train them to fly anything, and if they happen to go to an airline, great. But a lot of these folks that do this don't ever end up in a steerman. So why are we training them to fly things like that? Maybe what we really need to do is just train them to be a really good first officer and a CRJ to start. And if somebody wants to come out and fly after that, then it's incumbent upon them to get the proper training to maybe fly their friend Cessna 210. So we're seeing some changes in that market, and the customers are starting to figure out, look, there's jobs out there. The sooner I get this done, the faster I'm going to be in that job. And I've even had some applicants on checkrides be able to tell me the difference between if they get to the job in 1 year versus another, what their career earnings potential is as they look at senior points 30 years down the road at a major airline. So, that time spent training sometimes makes a big difference in where people choose to do it and how they do it. And much of that training that's being offered is very, very much focused on driving people to those airlines. Some of the universities have, fantastic programs. There's fantastic throughput hiring agreements, and most of those people are really kind of set up to go work for an airline. Some do come out and work at other positions, and maybe they happen to go fly in Alaska in a bush plane, but the overwhelming majority have been given a basic core set of knowledge that sets them up to flow right into an airline. And that we're seeing kind of as a change in this training environment, where historically it was a more generalized training and people kind of funneled where they want. This is really career-based training that we're providing in the academy and university-style training environments.
And just to contrast those, the folks who might be, for example, at the small mom and pop airports, Part 61, no syllabus, these are the kinds of things historically where a lot of people, as you said, be at the airport, waiting around a little bit. Tell us a little bit about, as you call the throughput training market, the academies, the universities. What do those look like in terms of, volume of students? I mean, these are really kind of big businesses compared to the mom and pop businesses we see at small airports.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, these are very, very large-scale training environments. I mean, we're talking many students. In many cases, they're 300, 400, 500, 600 students that are in a program at a time. Some are doing contract training for other airlines, for foreign nationals. Some are, doing training that's specific to an airline. In many cases, these are fleets of aircraft that are 30, 40, 50, in some cases over 100 aircraft in a business operation. If we think of some of the companies like ATP or like American Flyers, we're talking tens of locations around the country where they can provide this training. And we're finding that people travel to this training, they set up housing, there's agreements for all this. This really is a business training model. It's not about, geez, I bought my local 172 and I'd like somebody to teach me to do it. If you go to some of these providers and say, hey, can you provide me that? They're going to say, look, that's just not what we do. Call your local FBO. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. They're getting very specified with what their core business is. They have a syllabus set up. In most cases, either it's Part 141, or even if it's not Part 141, it is a 61 training environment that is set up very similarly to with syllabuses that got everything, set up in it. So it may not be a 141 approved, but it sure in many cases acts like a structured training environment where they have each lesson dialed in and they're going to do those and continue on. So these are business training operations that are multiple aircraft, and you're going to be scheduled like that as a customer. You probably have certain slots each day, and it'll probably be 4 or 5 days a week. You'll have some ground slots. You might have a couple instructors that you work with, and it's set up in a true training environment that is less customized to the individual and more customized towards the structure of the training, and the individual kind of fits into that. Where we look at some of the local training, and there's not necessarily as much structure to that, but it can be a little more tailored to somebody who doesn't have the ability to travel to training, to take 9 months off and get that training done, and maybe wants to do it locally in the evenings and on the weekends. So there's good and bad in both of those, and we just know that that business model is set up right now to backfill the hiring needs of many of these airlines. So on the local FBO side, the good news is we're really developing a good cadre of senior instructors who in many cases are less focused on that career-based training, but more focused on the owner type training. And you do a lot of this with the Cirruses. I do some in some of the twin Cessnas and the Pipers, where it's somebody who wants to be an owner operator of their aircraft. And if somebody comes to me and says, geez, I really want to do a private pilot rating of my instrument next, and I want to get set up to go to an airline, I'm going to typically tell them, look, I'm not the right person for that. That's not what I do anymore personally. But if somebody says, hey, I bought myself a new Cessna 414 and I want to spend a week really getting to know my airplane, that's kind of the training that we see specialized people doing in local FBO kind of training markets at this point. And, keeping people current and flying in their personal aircraft, less focused on that career-based training. Doesn't mean you can't get some training at a local FBO that might give you the base, but in some cases we find people do their private locally and then jump into their instrument or multi-air commercial at an academy style. So there's some hybrids and some mixes, but we are seeing a large portion of that customer base really look at travel training, going to where the training is, where the weather's better, and where they can expedite the accomplishment of those ratings and certificates to get to that job.
Yeah, so clearly the academies, the large throughput type operations are a fairly efficient way for someone who wants to go work for the airlines or work for as a corporate pilot to very quickly, efficiently get those ratings cost effectively as possible. Now, I'm curious, what are some of the reasons you think that a CFI might decide in the future to work for one of these large academies versus working for an airlines or as a corporate pilot?
If we think about what makes somebody want to stay a professional instructor, maybe really stay as an aviation educator for a longer period of time, there are some certain benefits that some people really like. And don't get me wrong, there's days where having flight benefits on United or American or Delta would be awesome as a senior line pilot with, a lighter schedule, we'll say. Maybe you fly 8-10 days a month and you got the rest of the month to use those flight benefits and cruise around the world. But on those 8 or 10 days a month that you fly, and certainly more days a month that you fly or might sit reserve as a regional pilot, you might not be home many times. You might have to be based out of airports that are not where you physically want to live, and that's where the job is. In some cases, you can find as a professional aviation educator that you find yourself at home every night. You have a little more structured work schedule, and there's some benefits to that as we look at how these training providers are attracting instructors that may want to stay longer. We're seeing the pay rates come up. We're seeing benefits increase, especially at university and collegiate environments where they have faculty that are hired in to do this type of training, and they're full-time, longer-term faculty that come with benefits and all the fun things that come with being a university professor. So as we look at the changes that are happening in that hiring market, we certainly have a cadre of individuals who may not want to choose to fly at an airline or a corporate operator and be on call or have that midnight arrival flight, and would rather have a much more structured environment where they can teach out of. And there's some values in that lifestyle that are attractive for many people.
And that's certainly why I continue to teach. There have been times in my life where I've thought, wouldn't it be great to work for the airlines? But bottom line is I did a whole lot of travel when I was working in the high-tech industry, and I'm just tired of seeing hotel rooms. I like being home at night and, being with my family and being able to record podcasts and do whatever I'd like. And, frankly, I'm just not real big on waking up at 4 a.m. in some strange city and then hustling out to pre-flight an airliner.
Well, yeah, and that even, sometimes that 4 a.m. call out to drive 2 hours to get to that corporate flight is really not any different. So that environment can be a big difference too. And don't get me wrong, in the long part of the summer when I have a student that says, hey, we need to do that night cross country and it's not dark till 10:30, it's a little rough, but those are few opportunities that we have to do that. It's not an everyday thing for us when we do this training side. So there's definitely certainly some benefits to being a professional aviation educator, a CFI for life. And there's some pretty cool things we get to see as we teach. And see that learning process, and especially if you diversify a little bit as an instructor and have multiple aircraft or that you work with, or you do private instrument multi, kind of mix up the training you're doing, you do get a little bit of a variety in that operation. So, as we see the regional airlines actively hiring away CFIs, we see training providers increasing their offerings to those CFIs to keep them there and to keep that business model of training successful. And at some point, the choice to go to an airline means a pay cut. And that's actually kind of where we were at, when we kind of look back to the mid 90s, the late 90s. Many people were staying at CFIs for 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 flight hours instead of 700 because they would have to take a $10,000 or $15,000 a year pay cut to go take that first airline job, and now they're taking a $10,000 or $15,000 pay increase, and that's pretty darn attractive. But when you really think about it, if we put instructors to a financial choice of, man, you got a nice, good job going here at a university, and you really want to go to that airline and take $20,000 a year less, I think it gets a lot more motivating to get people to stay there, and there's a long-term consultation, I guess, that happens in their mind of, all right, well, if I take a $20,000 a year pay cut now, eventually I'm going to get it back, but how long? And, we start looking at that career potential. I think there are a number of people who are in the training industry that would stay there for the right compensation. And with the shortage of CFIs, we're starting to see the business model work to try and keep some of those people.
So one solution to the shortage of CFIs obviously would be to get more people to become CFIs. And let's just, assuming somewhere out there among our listeners, there are people who might now be thinking, it might be kind of fun to become a CFI someday. Tell us a little about some of the different paths that one can follow to become a flight instructor.
Sure, there's a few different paths that they can do. I mean, the reality is in one way or another, you're going to go use that PTS and make sure you meet the standards and go take a practical test somewhere, either with the FAA staff or with a designated pilot examiner. And wherever you do the training, that's basically the path you're going to have to go through after a couple written tests. But you can do that in a couple of different ways. And some of the large programs have it built in where you may take that training there and then come back and do some service at that training provider. And in some cases, we're finding CFIs are being given away largely for free as long as you stay for 6 or 9 months to provide training there as an employee. And that's kind of a change we've had since the past. There's a longer term process. You can do this at a local FBO if they have the right aircraft equipment available with a senior instructor, or in many cases, people are traveling to some of the, we'll call them shotgun approach CFI training environments where they're being done in 2 to 3 weeks and really getting it done quickly, where it's an intensive moment where you basically dive in from day one and you live, breathe, and eat CFI training. And at the end of a couple of weeks, they throw you into a check ride and you go. So we've certainly known a number of students who've done that. And there are providers all around the country doing that really do a good job of it. I guess the best advice I would give of anybody who's asking of themselves is this the best way to do it? And I'll disappear for 2 weeks and go do my CFI. Make sure you ask the question of the training provider, how quickly are you able to schedule a practical test? Because we do have, as we talked about in the previous show, some areas where there are significant waits for practical tests. And in one case, I remember a poor student that I'd given check rides to. She went out, did her training, and then was told, come back in 7 weeks for a practical test. And that's really not a great way to set yourself up for a CFI after you get everything all squared up, and then you got to wait 7 weeks to do the test. So, if somebody is looking to travel, train, and do an intensive short course for a CFI, make sure you're going to be in a location where that practical test is going to be delivered very, very closely to when you're done with that training.
Let's go ahead and why don't you go ahead and name some of these, as you said, shotgun intensive courses where you might do a CFI in less than a month.
Oh, God, that's a good question to name them. So, I know we've got a few of them out there. There's a couple in Florida. ATP can certainly do some of them. Colorado Contrails in Denver does them. I know there's a CFI Academy down in, I think, San Diego, if I'm not mistaken. There's another one in Lakeland, Florida, that a number of people have done. So if you kind of do some digging around, very quickly, if you look for CFI short course in a Google search, you're going to find some of these come up. And finding the one that best fits you is part of the game. So I think, both of you and I are aware of a friend of ours that did it. I think he was in Tallahassee. That was Rod Rakich recently, did his out there. So it can happen very, very quickly. But you'll notice most of these that I named are not in places like, Erie, Pennsylvania, where they just got 3 feet of snow, or Michigan, where I just got 3 feet of snow. They're places where you have good weather and locations that are consistently able to deliver that training. When you show up for 2 weeks, you're probably not going to find 2 weeks of low overcast 1,200-foot ceilings that leave you sitting in the hotel room either.
And a couple other I can think of would be American Flyers. I know they have a number of locations around the country, and they do a significant number of CFI certificates. Another one that I know of locally is CFI Boot Camp. And there's a former DPE who used to give check rides here in the San Francisco Bay Area who has been running that for a few years. And I know that they do a lot of that training locally here in Palo Alto, but they also occasionally go on the road as well and give training. Now, I got my CFI years ago. Gosh, it was back in 2001. At a local FBO and used a local flight instructor. Why don't you talk about the kind of trade-offs of doing it that way versus going to an academy and going away from home for 3-4 weeks to do it?
Sure. And, I did the exact same thing. And for me, it was a function of I'm doing it, in my case, while I was still in college. It was on my undergrad program. I didn't do a degree in aviation. I was doing that on the side, and I wasn't able to travel and go away and do some kind of training. So it also let me spread that out a little bit, get those knowledge tests done over some time and build it up. And the benefit of doing that is many cases it's going to be local training. The immediate thing that comes to mind when you think about traveling for training is you're going to not only have that cost for the training itself, but you're certainly going to have that cost that goes with traveling there and putting yourself up, whether it be in a hotel or whatever kind of lodging you're going to look for while you do that training. And that can get very expensive over 2, 3, 4 weeks of training time. In some cases, folks have family or friends they can stay with in a location. And I've seen people that choose the provider of the training that they're going to use basically on where they have somebody that they can stay with, and that makes a difference too. So if you happen to have family or friends that you can crash on their basement couch for 3 weeks in a place where there's a good training operation, fantastic, that saves you some money. But if you don't and you want to avoid the cost of doing that, maybe you choose to do it locally as well and stretch that training out and have a little bit more availability to do it while you're working or going to school or whatever it happens to be at the same time. And that's certainly one of the bigger determining factors that many people go through in terms of trying to figure out, can I disappear for a period of time and do that training or not? 2-3 weeks off is a significant portion of time for somebody to take and take out of their life and family and go do that training.
And I did mine while I was working as well, too, so that makes it a lot easier to be staying at home. And even if you do have to spread it out over some period of time, at least it's something you can fit into your life if you do it at a local FBO. And I'm trying to think some of the other considerations. The instructor has got to have what? How much experience?
So this is a piece that you find that we're starting to have some concerns about this as well. The instructor's got to have at least 200 hours of dual instruction given, and they have to have been a CFI for at least 2 years. What we're finding is as we have this instructor turnover, many of the flight training providers have very few instructors who have more than 2 years of experience still working for them. Now, there's some ways around that. You can have a lesser experienced instructor provide the bulk of the training and have a senior instructor that only provides the last 3, 4, 5 hours of training and still get that sign off done. So when you find training providers that have larger cadres of instructor staff, they're starting to leverage their senior staff like that, where they may not provide all of the training, but kind of serve as the capstone instructor towards the end and be the sign-off instructor. If you're looking at a local training provider, that is something that if they only have 1 or 2 CFIs on staff, if none of them happen to have that experience level, if they haven't been around there for a while, they may not actually be able to provide the sign-off for the training. And where we find some of the local FBOs make up for that is they do reach out to those more senior folks that maybe come back from an airline and want to do a little instruction part-time, and maybe they do 10 or 15 hours a week, take a couple students instead of 7 or 8 students at a time, and they focus on that type of training. So that is something that somebody would certainly want to ask of a training provider if they were considering them. Do you have somebody who has the requisite experience to be able to actually provide my sign-off?
And certainly when people go for the commercial check ride, they have to have a retractable gear aircraft available to them. Also true for the CFI or not?
That is still true for the CFI. At this moment, I will say there's some potential changes coming down the road here that were based on notice of proposed rulemaking. We're waiting for some final rules to come out. Not to bring up the politics question, but some of that depends on a congressional budget approving some of the funding to make those rule changes. So we don't know exactly when that's going to come out, but there may be some changes that allow TAA aircraft, as defined in those rules, to supplement or substitute for a retractable gear aircraft. But for the time being, somebody does still have to show up at a CFI check ride with a retractable gear aircraft. And in most cases, they're doing that either in an Aero or 172 or 182 RG or some of these types of aircraft. In some cases, some of the training providers do an initial CFI in a multi-engine aircraft. For example, they might just use a Seminole, and that does get the requirement out of the way as well. For having a complex aircraft on that CFI initial check ride. That is only the case on the initial CFI check ride. So if somebody does then go on and add on a multi-engine or an instrument instructor check ride, while most multi-engine aircraft are retractable, it is not required for those two check rides for somebody to have a complex aircraft.
Well, I hope they make that change so that people can use TAA aircraft. Certainly, I see a lot of flight schools these days that have one aircraft that they keep for commercial check rides or CFI check rides. It's usually a 172 RG or a Piper Aero, and typically they're at least 40 years old.
Yeah, and I think in many cases the binder twine and baling wire that we're using to hold those together, we'd be better off actually just using a nice new modern aircraft for this training. And we do have some challenges without these aircraft being large parts of the production fleet anymore of keeping the older aircraft flying, and that can actually be a challenge in the training too, and something somebody might want to ask. If I'm traveling to a training location and they tell me I have 18 students in the pipeline for a CFI, and we have 3 CFIs going to do it, and we have 1 Aero, I might want to ask the question of, so when's the next 100 hour, or when's the annual coming up on that? Because I don't want to get halfway through my training and find out that the airplane's going to go down for a week and hang me up on my training and check ride. So let alone if something breaks and we need parts. So there are certainly challenges with these older aircraft, and if you're looking for a training provider that's going to really get you through that and keep it moving, maybe you want to see if they got 2 or 3 of these aircraft available. That way, if one does run into a maintenance hiccup, you're going to be able to keep that training going at least.
Bingo. Yeah, I was just thinking of that as well. I would recommend that anybody traveling to some distance to take this kind of training, make sure they've got more than one of the particular aircraft that you're going to train in. Otherwise, you may find yourself coming home for a few weeks until it comes out of the shop or finishes an annual or something like that. So for people who are contemplating getting their CFI, tell us about the different written exams they have to take, and also what could they start reading right now, even before they start doing formal training, to get them prepared?
Well, there's a lot of resources out there, certainly on CFI training, and the best thing I'm going to tell you, anybody who's interested in becoming a CFI, is don't reinvent the wheel. There's wonderful training products providers out there that have done this for years and years and years. If we think of the folks that are out there like ASA and King Schools and Sporties, they're providing materials, and really that's part of our job as an instructor, is to use good reference materials. The same should hold true on your check ride. Don't show up and think you have to rewrite the book. Use the books that are there and leverage those materials so you can start going back to even the basic private pilot, instrument pilot, commercial pilot textbooks and reviewing those and getting your knowledge up. And basically the whole goal of a CFI is to transition from I know how to do this knowledge to I know how to teach this knowledge. And if you really kind of go into a CFI training program thinking like that, it's going to make everything go a lot smoother and a lot easier. So you basically can go back to those original materials and start working through refresh and then working on it. As we go from there, we do have an aviation flight instructor's handbook the FAA puts out, and obviously the FAA publications, the Airplane Flying Handbook and the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge are wonderful things to start going back through. And they also have a Fundamentals of Instructing book. So going into those publications is a great spot even before you go to take any training to get yourself kind of a leg up and ahead of that training and start preparing yourself for the knowledge test. You asked the question of what tests are out there, and if we think about the initial CFI, the minimum tests that are going to have to be taken are a Fundamentals of Instructing test and a flight instructor airplane test. There's certainly a flight instructor instrument test for an instrument instructor add-on. And then I would also advise folks, and I really kind of spread this to as many as I can, the flight instructor airplane test and the advanced ground instructor test are very, very similar knowledge test banks. If you study for one, you're probably going to pass the other. It's also one of those things that when you study it once, you're probably never going to study it again in your life. If you have any desire to add a ground instructor certificate on, it's a great time to do that at the same time. Basically take that flight instructor airplane and the advanced ground instructor certificate test, even the same day if you want, and get both of those done. The ground instructor certificate is something that is issued as a result of having taken either the FOI and the AGI, or having had the flight instructor certificate already and then taking the advanced ground instructor, that AGI test. It's purely paperwork, and you get issued a ground instructor certificate either by an FAA staff member if you visit your local FAA office, or some DPEs can also issue them. I do this for many of the CFIs that happen to get this done in our local area. By getting a ground instructor certificate, you get the option to either one, get a gold seal certificate if you have the proper pass rate later, or potentially use that certificate if you ever teach in something like a simulator environment or want to teach ground schools. It's kind of a good thing just to add on while you're doing it, because you'll probably never do it at another time. So the fundamentals of instructing test is a prerequisite for that CFI rating as well, unless you have a teaching certificate or have taught. There's a couple little kind of quirky ways around that, but for most people, an FOI, that fundamentals of instructing test, is required, which means you've got 2 knowledge tests prior to that CFI. Same holds true of the instrument instructor. You're going to have a CFI instrument test. There's also an instrument ground instructor test you can take. Again, same database pretty much. So if you're taking one, you might as well take them both and get that instrument ground instructor added on as well. So just kind of a good tip there while you're doing it. So there's a series of knowledge tests that you have prior to taking that practical test. And what I really encourage folks to do, if you are going to do any travel training, try and get those knowledge tests out of the way before you go travel to do any CFI training, to try and get that done at the same time while you're studying for that practical test and preparing your flight experience can be a really big distraction and just one more piece of pressure. So, if you're thinking about doing this, take a couple weekends and study hard on it and get those knowledge tests done before you go do that training. And it's just one less thing that you have to worry about while you're doing the training.
Yeah, and just to talk about the ground instructors, I actually became a ground instructor before I became a CFI by, 6 months or something like that. And I found that was an incredibly good way to help to continue to quickly get in front of students and to teach them, and to help me in my further preparation to pass my flight instructor exam. So I think that's a really nice stepping stone, just to become a ground instructor. Then you can actually do some teaching. Doesn't have to be a formal ground school. It could actually be helping another flight instructor, teaching some of the required ground instruction for those students. So do you see that much? And any other thoughts on ground instructors?
I see that occasionally. It's not super common. Most people just kind of dive in and do the test at the same time. But one other piece of advice I've given to some folks that I have either worked with for CFI renewals when they've let their CFI lapse, or even a couple people have done it prior to getting their CFI, is to actually take a flight instructor refresher course. So every 2 years, an instructor may choose to take that as one method for keeping their cert renewed. But there's nothing that stops you as a CFI applicant from taking a course like that online or in person to just kind of get a good piece of information base, built into your mind prior to even taking that test. So they're 16-hour courses, and those courses can be a great way to kind of refresh your knowledge and start getting into that CFI training environment as well.
That's a great idea. I had never thought about using a FERC, a flight instructor refresher course, as a way for training to become a flight instructor. So thanks for suggesting that. And so just to kind of follow up on the CFI shortage and how that impacts students, is there anything that a student pilot can do to make sure that the CFI shortage is not impacting their training?
Yeah, Max, it's a good question. There certainly is, and one of the things I think that's important for a savvy customer to do is when they are getting assigned an instructor, especially at larger training environments where there's a large number of instructors, is to really ask whether that scheduling individual or the CFI themselves can answer the question of are they going to be there for a while? If you're looking at starting your private pilot certificate training and it's going to be a 4-month process, and your new CFI that's been assigned to you says, "Man, this is great. I'm really looking forward to starting at regional airline X in 3 days." You're probably with the wrong person. So if you're looking at something that's a quick, short course, many places do a commercial single engine add-on that can be done in a couple weeks. And, if you've got a CFI that's leaving in a month, that's probably not a big deal. But if you're looking at starting your base training, whether it's a private or instrument, and you've got 4 or 5 months of training ahead, finding a way to minimize the effect of the turnover of the instructors on your own training may be as simple as asking the question of, so how close are you to leaving and going to another professional flying job? And if they say it's coming up really quickly, it might be time just to ask, hey, do you have an instructor who's planning on sticking around a little bit longer that might be able to better serve my training needs?
Jason, that's really excellent advice for anyone who's a student pilot or thinking about starting flight training. And I want to thank you so much for joining me here today and sharing all this great information. I'm sure Simon never expected to get his question answered by an expert on the shortage and to get it in this detail. But thank you so much for joining us today on the Aviation News Talk podcast.
Well, it's my pleasure. Look forward to maybe a third visit at some point. And if Simon really wants to dig into it, there's about 25 pages in a white paper up on my website. He's more than welcome to dig into it. But I suspect he's more really interested in finding a way to get his training. And I wish him the best of luck as he does it and continues into a career in aviation, because it's a really cool field, and welcome him to it.
Go ahead. Tell him where that website is.
Sure, the website's really simple. It's just jasonblair.net. So JASONBLAIR.net. And for anybody who finds that, you'll also find a bunch of other things that I've written, and some good tips on what to do and what not to do on checkrides. So if you got one coming up with me, I strongly encourage you to review it. And I promise I won't get mad if you got the cheat sheet and did everything great on the checkride. I don't care why you learn this stuff. As long as you learn it and do a good job, we're looking forward to have lots of good pilots out there.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. We'll look forward to having you back for your third time.
I'll be there.
Thanks again. And as you can tell, Jason is one of the many great people in this industry who does a lot to contribute to it and to help other people reach their aviation goals. And to make it easy for you to find that CFI white paper he's written, I put a link in the show notes, and I've also posted on Patreon. So as you know, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome and then click on post, and you'll find it right there. And by the way, I'm just back from a 3-day training conference with Cirrus down in San Diego, and I'll be sharing lots of details about that show in the coming weeks. So if you are thinking of buying a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now. Let's go ahead and get you started in the process. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And by the way, if you love this show, the only way people find out about it is if you tell them. Go ahead and let your friends know about the show. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.